Greetings all, welcome back to the best film show in the multiverse. I am your host, Jedi Master Right All the Time, and today we're going to be discussing the conclusion to the greatest trilogy ever made, beloved by all, a pinnacle of modern cinema. I am, of course, talking about Return of the King! Oh wait, sorry. 2023 actually marks the 40-year anniversary of Return of the Jedi. Guess we should talk about that then. I love the original Star Wars trilogy, okay? It is crazy to me that to this day, despite all the negativity and division which surrounds this franchise, these three movies have still not lost their magic. They are the definition of lightning in a bottle and will always be untouchable. Whatever happens with Star Wars, no matter how many bad decisions Disney want to make, we will always be able to go back and watch the original trilogy, and to me that's beautiful. But while I have adored Star Wars and Empire for years, Return of the Jedi has always been that awkward younger brother I very rarely visit. Basically, I usually reach Empire and am so completely spellbound by the experience that I just kind of forget to watch the finale. Because of this, I genuinely think I've only seen Return of the Jedi like 3 or 4 times, and on this most recent rewatch I just finished, I can kind of see why. This film is so bizarre in so many ways, and I have so much to say about it. Partially just because I think it's a really great representation of Star Wars as a franchise. Return of the Jedi contains both the best and worst of Star Wars, and to a further extent, the best and worst of George Lucas. So please indulge me as I take a deep dive into the weirdest conclusion to a franchise in film history. Yeah, because those new ones, they're not canon. Anyway. Oh, and just a side note, I only watch the despecialized editions, and I call A New Hope Star Wars, because I'm an old-fashioned purist. Anyway, let's go. So this is genuinely one of the strangest films I've ever seen. On one hand, it's gotta be one of the biggest missed opportunities in cinema history, and seriously weighs down the trilogy. It's messy, clunky, poorly written, poorly directed, lazily acted for the most part, and somehow manages to feel both really rushed and incredibly sluggish at the same time. But on the other hand, it's the original Star Wars trilogy, man. All the idiosyncrasies are still here, the beautiful set designs, the weird characters and creatures, amazing practical effects, the iconic soundscape, and I feel like the first two do so much legwork that Return of the Jedi is just about able to crawl over the finish line. Most importantly, because despite faltering on nearly everything, it completely sticks the landing when it matters most. Because of this reason, I cannot really bring myself to dislike this film. In fact, I actually like Return of the Jedi quite a lot. But it certainly contains many flaws, and I do have a lot to say. So let's just talk about why this film is so weird. So we begin with the iconic title crawl, and to be honest, I'd say this is one of the better crawls in the saga. We're reminded that a frozen Han Solo is in the possession of Jabba the Hutt, and that our heroes have rendezvoused. Wait, is that a word? Rendezvoused. Let's say it is. Our heroes have rendezvoused on Tatooine to get him back. So one thing I don't really understand is how Luke and Lando discussed this plan at the end of Empire, but a whole year has passed since then? Why did this plan take so long to execute? Was Lando just chilling in Tatooine, posing as a guard for a whole year, while Luke was training and becoming a Jedi Knight? Poor guy. Anyway, then we learn that the Empire has built a new Death Star.
Somehow
The Death Star
returned.
Whoa. Nah, I never knew that.
Honestly, I'm fine with the second Death Star. I know some people really hate it and find it lazy, but I never really have. Also, I love the "little does Luke know" line. It's like the most George Lucas thing ever written. In summary, good title crawl, I'm fine with everything so far. So straight away we get our first look at the second Death Star, and oh my god, that thing looks awesome. This first small scene with Vader is pretty good, although I will take this moment just to talk about the Empire in Return of the Jedi. Because in the previous film, the Empire are shown to be pretty competent. I mean, the movie is literally called The Empire Strikes Back. They're constantly on the rebellion's tail. Vader is murdering officers left and right whenever they mess up. And in the end of the film, the Empire wins. But by the time of Return of the Jedi, they clearly just stopped striking back. I don't know, they're just chilling in this one, which is a bit weird. I mean, we'll get back to the whole Ewok thing later, but honestly, not including the Emperor, the Empire just doesn't feel that scary anymore. This is especially clear when you watch this right after Empire Strikes Back, because that film is so dark and foreboding, and the tonal whiplash going from that to the giddy space romp, Muppet Show weirdness of Jedi It's a tiny bit jarring. Anyway, then we have the infamous Jabba's Palace scene, which is 24 minutes long and is our first sign that this movie, it ain't gonna be like the last two. Especially when it comes to pacing, structure, and most importantly, efficiency. I think the kindest way to describe this entire sequence is that it's essentially an extended version of the cantina scene from the first film. Weird music, a plethora of new creatures and aliens which really help expand and flesh out the seedier parts of this universe. The designs for these characters are amazing, and it really helps that all the effects and puppetry have just aged so well. Jabba the Hutt is the obvious example. He's a great antagonist, and I love how Jedi mind tricks don't work on him. Basically the universal sign in Star Wars that a character isn't dumb. But I also really like Max Rebo, the little blue elephant guy, Bib Fortuna, the Gamorrean guards, and of course the best character in Star Wars history, Salacious B. Crumb. The whole vibe of this scene is like some weird, independent, avant-garde, surreal fantasy fever dream. It's very George Lucas, it's all very weird, and I really like it. Unfortunately, the plot elements which take place in this brilliantly constructed, creepy Muppet sex dungeon are kind of bizarre. Anyone who's seen Return of the Jedi knows Luke's plan doesn't really make any sense. 3PO and R2 arrive and are captured. Then Leia comes in with Chewie and they're captured. Then Luke walks in, tries to shoot Jabba with a gun, and is captured. Was this all part of the plan? I'd love to know what was going on in the writer's room here, because I've never really understood any of it. Remember, this is the conclusion to an epic space opera. Don't get me wrong, the beginning of the original Star Wars is pretty slow, but it works there because it's gradually introducing us to this universe. And let's face it, this is iconic. Return of the Jedi doesn't seem to realize it's the finale until like the last 30 minutes. More on the structure of this film later though. Let's talk a bit more about the small moments in this scene I enjoy. I really like this short bit in the droid back room or whatever, where 3PO sees what happened to the previous protocol droid. This is dark stuff, man. Boba Fett throughout this scene is badass, especially his small nod of mutual bounty hunter respect to Leia after she threatens to blow the palace up. Insanely cool. More on Boba Fett later though. I love this camera pan to reveal Han Solo still frozen in carbonite. While Richard Marquand's directing here is definitely the weakest in the trilogy, there's still some cool stuff peppered throughout this film. For example, this shot is one of my favourites in Star Wars history. I do think the Rancor pit scene is pretty dull. It's not shot well at all, and the moment afterwards where we see the Rancor owner mourning his pet or whatever, I do find it hilarious, of course, but at this point, let me remind you, we are 27.5 minutes into the conclusion to the greatest film saga ever, and I'm just bewildered at George Lucas and why he thought this was the direction the movie should go in. Like, don't get me wrong, I really get the impression that this whole scene was just a ton of passionate people in the middle of the desert, designing a bunch of weird aliens and seeing what they could get away with. It still feels like real, authentic Star Wars, and it's certainly better than anything we got in the prequels or sequels. But isn't this supposed to be the conclusion to an epic space saga? Why are we spending so much time with all this stuff? So then we get this fight scene in the Tatooine desert, which contains probably the only effects of the entire trilogy which do look very dated, but whatever. This entire sequence is messy as hell. Not only do we not really understand what is going on, I mean Luke's nod to Lando seems to suggest this was all part of some convoluted plan, which is hard to believe. But the whole thing is also just shot and edited really awkwardly. Luckily, with the help of John Williams and the pure Star Wars-ness of it all, it's not like a bad scene or anything, it just could have been a lot better, I feel. Now look, in theory I'm fine with Boba Fett dying at this point in the film. Yes, I think it would have been better if he stuck around for a bit longer, but it doesn't ruin the movie or anything. However, the way he goes out is just annoying. Clearly George Lucas underestimated how much people would like that character, but come on, he's seen to be so badass and such a competent bounty hunter in the previous film. And the fact that a half-blind, carbonite-recovering Han Solo kills him by accident, it's really lame, I'm not gonna lie. And that yell he does as he falls into the Sarlacc pit, cartoonishly flailing his arms about, it really goes against everything we've learnt about him up until this point. Anyway, eventually our heroes get away, Leia kills Jabba, cool. And that's basically the first act of Return of the Jedi. I have mixed feelings on it overall. When you compare its first act to Star Wars or The Empire Strikes Back, it is a little thin. Other than perfectly establishing Luke Skywalker as a far more mature and powerful protagonist compared to the previous two films, all this first act is really used for is to save Han Solo, who doesn't really end up doing much again, at least not until the third act. But we'll get to Han and the overall structure of this film in a bit. First, we need to talk about the second act.
This is... What? This is boring.
Other than a relatively exciting speeder bike chase sequence, The next 40 minutes are pretty boring. I'd actually say this middle act of Return of the Jedi is the worst Star Wars we get from the entire original trilogy. Clearly Lucas knew he wanted the first act to be saving Han Solo and the third act to be the final battle against the Empire, but this middle portion just feels directionless, like filler or padding. We do, however, get this very short scene where we are introduced to the Emperor in the flesh for the first time, and yeah, it's pretty good. Everyone knows how great Ian McDiarmid is in this role. I love how everyone in the Empire is clearly terrified of the guy. Also, I'll take this moment just to applaud some of the more technical aspects of Return of the Jedi, which, unlike the writing, match the insane quality level from the first two films. Like, this is a painting. That just blows my mind. I know it's not going to happen, but I really wish films were still made like this. To me, this is just clearly superior to anything you could do with CGI. So afterwards, we get the scene where Luke returns to Dagobah to meet with Yoda once again. Let's talk about how Return of the Jedi deals with exposition. I think people often see exposition as something inherently bad, but this really isn't the case. Relaying information to the audience is an essential part of any story, especially when it comes to science fiction and fantasy. Good exposition should teach you exactly what you need to know in a way which is understandable, efficient, and perhaps most importantly, without your brain ever really latching onto the fact that it is exposition. I would say this is something Star Wars and Empire do incredibly well in. Yet for the prequels and sequels, the exact opposite is true. As for Return of the Jedi, it probably falls somewhere in the middle. It is pretty ambiguous throughout this film what events have occurred since The Empire Strikes Back, or even how long it's been. Did Luke go back to Yoda after escaping from Cloud City? Well, the answer's no, but I had to look that up. It's not really clear in this film. However, we do get two scenes, one with Yoda and one with Ghost Obi-Wan, confirming that Vader is in fact Luke's father. And I don't know, it never even occurred to me that Vader might have been lying in the previous film. He literally said, "Search your feelings, you know it to be true." Luke then searched his feelings and found it to be true. He literally calls the guy father 5 minutes later. I don't think this had to be in the film. When Yoda confirms the truth to Luke, it's played as this really dramatic moment. We even get a reprise of the Imperial March. I just don't really get it. Perhaps it was different in 1983. Obviously, to a modern audience, Vader has just always been Luke's father. But I don't know, man. It sometimes feels like Return of the Jedi still has one foot in the previous film. Anyway, Yoda then tells Luke that there is in fact another Skywalker, before becoming one with the Force. It is a pretty powerful scene overall. Obviously, Yoda is a brilliant character in these two movies. Everything about him, from his dialogue to the insanely excellent puppetry, to of course John Williams' beautiful theme, a personal favourite of mine in the history of music. It's all just so iconic. I could talk about it for hours, and if I ever discuss Empire Strikes Back on this channel, I probably will. However, I find it all to be a little rushed and abrupt. Yoda dies only 5 minutes after being reintroduced, and it doesn't feel like enough. My love for the Yoda scenes in Empire aside, Luke doesn't really have anything to do in this film's second act, and I think the writers missed a big opportunity for him to spend a bit more time with Yoda, maybe even have a few more Jedi lessons before facing Vader. And I think this is a very consistent thing with Return of the Jedi. What we have is great, but even the film's biggest admirers can admit that there are a lot of missed opportunities. However, I really do love how Yoda just fades into nothingness, kinda like Obi-Wan in the first film. John Williams' score is very fitting, and the lights going out in the hut is a warm touch. We then get another Jedi exposition scene, this time from Obi-Wan. A small thing I really appreciate here is how Luke actually calls him Obi-Wan instead of Ben for the first and only time in the trilogy. It's a subtle gesture, but perfectly bridges the two characters and shows how much Luke has matured and is now fully committed to the Jedi way. This scene is less emotionally resonant than the previous one, but I understand they have to address Obi-Wan straight up hoodwinking Luke in the first film, and the whole from a certain point of view thing kind of works if you don't overthink it, so I'm fine with that. It's also here we learn that the other Skywalker is in fact Leia. Let's talk about this for a second, because I know now it's just an accepted fact that Luke and Leia are siblings, but going back to this film, it does just kind of come out of nowhere, and nothing is done with it other than it being something Vader can use to taunt and anger Luke with later on. If you didn't know, the original plan was that the sequel trilogy would involve Luke searching for his long-lost sister, but that was ultimately scrapped. And we don't really need to talk about what happened with the actual sequel trilogy. However, there was this loose thread of Yoda's declaration in Empire that there is another, and clearly this needed to be resolved in Return of the Jedi. Combining this with that beautiful scene at the end of Empire where Leia speaks to Luke through the Force, it does make sense. I just don't really understand what was going on in the writer's room, really. It's all a bit inconsistent, which is why we have stuff like this. Overall, this is a far less foreshadowed and far less impactful revelation than the Vader one we got in Empire Strikes Back. Although, to be fair to Return of the Jedi, it's clearly not trying to be on that same level, so fine. One more thing, despite the somewhat clunky exposition of these two scenes, I really like how even such esteemed Jedi as Yoda and Obi-Wan do not think that Anakin Skywalker can be brought back to the light side. They're telling him, yeah, you're gonna have to straight up murder this guy, and Luke's like, I don't want to do that. It's very similar to how in Avatar The Last Airbender, all the previous avatars are telling Aang he has no choice but to kill Fire Lord Ozai, a character who is funnily enough voiced by Mark Hamill.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
So in the following scene, Luke, Han, Leia, Lando, and all the rebels finally meet up to plan their space and ground assault on the Empire. And surely this is the point where the movie's really going to kick into gear and become just as exciting as the previous two movies. But it doesn't. Something just feels off. Maybe it's time to talk about perhaps my biggest problem with Return of the Jedi, and it breaks my heart to say this, but it's Han Solo. Harrison Ford, without a doubt, steals the first two movies. I would go as far as to say that along with John Williams' score, he is the best thing about the original trilogy, and perfectly encapsulates the magic of the franchise. The cocky smuggler with a heart of gold is such a fun archetype, and Ford is perfect as this character in both Star Wars and especially in Empire Strikes Back. I don't need to tell you any of this stuff, he's one of the greatest characters in film history. In Return of the Jedi, however, the guy just feels neutered, like his balls have been cut off. It's either that or our favourite pilot in the galaxy was inhaling a bit too much of that Endor grass, if you know what I'm saying. I think there's two main reasons for this, the first one being Harrison Ford himself. See, at this point, Ford really didn't want to be there. Unlike Hamill and Fisher, Ford only signed on for the first two films. That's why Han Solo was frozen in carbonite at the end of Empire. I guess so he could be written out of the film if Ford didn't sign on for Return of the Jedi. Eventually he did sign on for the film, which surprised George Lucas a bit because, if you didn't know, Harrison Ford doesn't really like Star Wars at all.
Are you looking forward to watching a Han Solo movie as a fan?
Not really.
Which is fair enough, you know, the guy was happy being a vice. To quote the man himself, "It's not that I wanted Han Solo to die. I wanted Han Solo to be able to lend some significant emotional weight to the story. I was resolved to be useful and to pass on responsibilities to others and get out of the way." End quote. Writer Lawrence Kasdan and producer Gary Kurtz echoed these sentiments, but George Lucas was adamant against the idea, famously stating that a dead Han Solo doesn't sell toys. What a guy. Basically, this all led to Ford giving an incredibly nonchalant performance throughout Return of the Jedi. He's just nothing like the energetic, swashbuckling character we see in Star Wars and Empire, and to be honest, I'd even throw The Force Awakens and Solo into that list. It's not like he's terrible or anything, the guy still has some good moments and memorable lines, but something's just off about the character and performance. It is so obvious that Harrison Ford does not want to be there, and I think it's a real shame. To be honest, while Ford's self-aware grumpiness is hilarious, I do wish I lived in an alternate universe where he appreciated the original Star Wars trilogy, or at the very least tried in this film, compared to simply collecting his check, which he's clearly doing here. But the second and probably more important reason why Han Solo isn't as good in this film is just a writing thing. I found this post on Reddit from 11 years ago by a now inactive user named Big Man Beardy, and I think he really nails it. So I'm just gonna read the quote. "The laws of modern narrative dictate that every devil-may-care rebel must either be destroyed or be tamed into something softer and kinder by the end of the story. We like our rebels, but we keep them on a short leash. Unfortunately for the audience of Return of the Jedi, the process of domestication is largely complete for Han Solo by the time we get to this point in the story. Instead of a smuggler, he's a general. Instead of annoying Princess Leia, he's pining for her. Instead of refusing to risk his neck to fight the Empire, he's volunteering said neck. Sure, he's still got the sarcastic attitude and the great lines, but he's been tamed, neutered, cleaned up. He was a much more interesting character when his alliance to the Alliance and his feelings for Leia were in turmoil." End quote. This is also the case of Lando Calrissian's betrayal of Han in the previous film, which here for some inexplicable reason is just completely dropped from the story. Like, I get that Han probably learnt from Leia or Chewbacca that Lando redeemed himself, but it would have been nice to maybe have this acknowledged or even seen firsthand, because watching Return of the Jedi right after Empire Strikes Back and seeing Han and Lando being so chummy with each other, It just doesn't feel right. It's like we're missing an entire scene between them, and I hate to say it, but it somewhat weakens the plot point from the previous film. And speaking of this, Han's indifference and lack of things to do or say in Return of the Jedi really takes away from him getting frozen in carbonite, and the entire first act of this film where he gets rescued, because, well, what was it all for? Why kill Han Solo off in the first place if it just means you have to spend the entire first act of the next film bringing him back? Why bring Han back only for him to be mostly lackluster in the film, just along for the ride? I think you could have easily given him an arc in Return of the Jedi, perhaps centered around sacrifice just as Harrison Ford had suggested. But if not, perhaps he should have died in Empire, because one could argue his arc is kind of complete by the second film. I'm not sure. I don't think it helps that Han's mission on Endor in the final act of Return of the Jedi is kind of lame. This all really reminds me of when in Game of Thrones, Melisandre waffles on about how Jon Snow was brought back from the dead for a reason, and then Jon proceeds to do basically nothing for the rest of the story. Not only does this diminish that incredible scene in Empire, but it really eats into the runtime of Return of the Jedi. It would have all made sense if, say, Han does end up dying, perhaps sacrificing himself in some heroic gunslinging duel against Boba Fett near the end of the movie, but nothing like this ever happens. He's just kind of there. He doesn't want to pilot the Millennium Falcon for some reason. He's not as cocky or all guns blazing as he was in the first two films. There's even this really annoying subplot where he thinks Leia likes Luke instead of him, which is honestly just a waste of time. Leia's another character in the film who just feels neutered. Han and Leia's relationship and sexual tension is one of the best things in Empire Strikes Back, and honestly it's probably my favourite on-screen romance in a PG film ever. But here, their incredible chemistry has mostly vanished. We go from this...
Captain, being held by you isn't quite enough to get me excited.
Sorry, sweetheart. I haven't got time for anything else.
to this.
Hold me.
You suck!
It is crazy how hard Luke carries Return of the Jedi on his back, compared to, say, Empire, where all three of our main protagonists are equally engaging. As I mentioned previously, the direction of Return of the Jedi is clearly the weakest in the original trilogy. The camera is predominantly static, motionless, and the shots for the most part feel flat, especially coming off the very dynamic and beautifully composited Empire Strikes Back. It really is night and day, to be honest. But apparently, for whatever reason, Lucas really liked this style of directing, which I think when you go back and watch the prequels kind of makes sense. For those of you who don't know, Richard Marquand was hired as a safe option, someone who was competent enough to finish the film on time without going over budget. But apparently Lucas and Marquand clashed a lot on set, leading to assistant directors and even Lucas himself directing certain portions of the film. And basically, I think all of this was a big shame, and is perhaps why the film feels a little off compared to Star Wars and Empire. I'd even claim Lucas constantly being on set and surrounded by yes men foreshadows how the production of the prequels would go. And I will say, in certain aspects, Return of the Jedi can feel a little prequel-y at times. Whether it's specific things like the large increase in characters just standing around explaining the plot to the audience, or the more general feeling that while what we are watching is fine, it could have been a lot better. Looking back, the missed opportunities scattered throughout Return of the Jedi were definitely a sign of things to come, unfortunately. Anyway, getting back to this scene, while I have just criticised Marquand's directing, I will give him credit when it's due, and I have always really liked this opening tracking shot which establishes the setting and makes you feel like one of the rebels. It's a very small touch, but I wish we had more stuff like this throughout the film, as it really enhances the storytelling in subtle ways. In this scene, we are introduced to such classic Star Wars characters as Andor's very own Mon Mothma, the legendary Nine Nub, and of course Admiral Akbar, who looks just incredible, doesn't he? Return of the Jedi is definitely the best movie in Star Wars and to a greater extent film history for creature design. Honestly, there's enough brilliant alien side characters in this film alone to fill a space cruiser. Anyway, we learn that the Emperor is overseeing the construction for the final stages of the second Death Star himself, and that many Bothans died for this information. So please, Disney, give us Rogue 2, Attack of the Bothans, right now, please. I think my only problem with this scene, other than Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher's really weird line delivery...
That's one.
General, count me in.
...is the apparent lack of stakes. When planning the assault on the first Death Star, it was made clear how ballsy of an operation it was. They speak of how specific the shot has to be to actually blow the thing up. and Han literally calls it a suicide mission. However, by this point we know our rebels have done it before, so there's no reason to believe they can't do it again, especially as this Death Star hasn't even been completed yet. So while in theory I am fine with the second Death Star, I wish there was a little more urgency in this scene. It kind of just feels like another mission with the boys, not the last-ditch Hail Mary assault I think it should have been portrayed as. But anyway, it still feels important. It's only after our heroes land on Endor where I think the movie really grinds to a halt, because for the next half an hour, nothing happens. We all know it, we've all seen the film. There is precisely zero plot development until Luke surrenders himself to Vader. This should never happen. There should never be a scene in a movie which does not progress the plot, develop character, establish tone. I mean, you could say this entire sequence introduces us to Endor and the Ewoks, but it's 30 minutes long. You could watch the entirety of Remedial Chaos Theory, then restart it and watch the first half again in that time. Think about how quickly and perfectly Tatooine or Hoth are established in Star Wars and Empire respectively. And it's not even like Endor and the Ewoks are established well. All we really learn is that Endor is a forest inhabited by furry creatures whose culture is tribal and whose technology is primitive. That's it. If we are gonna do the whole Ewok thing, why not dedicate this time to show how much the Ewoks hate the Empire for inhabiting their home? I don't even inherently dislike the Ewoks. I genuinely believe the whole Viet Cong thing George Lucas was famously trying to go for could have really worked here. But you have to actually show why the Ewoks want to fight the Empire. You have to tell us something about them, so we're invested. Instead we get this speeder bike chase sequence, which is, to be fair, really well edited and put together. I've heard people complain about the blue screen, but honestly, I think it just about holds up. And look, I really like exploring Endor. I think it looks beautiful, and I love the design of the scout troopers. They look badass. So this scene in a vacuum is fun to watch. However, it just doesn't need to be in the film. It adds absolutely nothing to the plot, characters, world building. There's just zero stakes. Compare it to the pod racing scene in Phantom Menace, which from an action point of view is similar to this one. However, here Anakin is racing for his freedom from slavery. The entire fate of the movie, and to a greater extent the saga, rests on this scene. But in Return of the Jedi, it's just a quick, fun action scene, so at least something exciting happens in this second act. Eventually, our protagonists are reunited in the Ewok camp. First, there's this really Saturday cartoon moment where Luke uses the Force on C-3PO so the Ewoks will worship him and let them all go. And then... and then everyone's just kind of chilling in this hut. And while I think 3PO explaining the story up until this point to all the Ewoks is kinda cute, where is the urgency? Aren't these guys on a super important mission? Isn't the entire galaxy depending on this very specific faction of rebels? Turning off the deflector shields or whatever? Nah, they're just gonna chill and tell stories, I guess. There is a nice scene where Luke tells Leia they're siblings. It's shot beautifully, and I really love how the music is a combination of both their themes. Nice work, John Williams. But dare I say it, it feels too little too late. Because by the time the plot picks up again, we are 82 minutes into this trilogy's supposedly epic finale. 82 minutes, huh. Hey, I know, let's recap what happens in the first 82 minutes of the previous two films. In Star Wars, we learn an evil galactic empire ran by wizard Space Hitler is engaged in a conflict with a plucky space rebellion whose members include a sassy princess who in a last-ditch effort to win the war inputs the instructions of how to blow up the Empire's planet-nuking space station into a wisecracking tin can and shoots him off into space. Eventually, these plans fall into the hands of a moisture farmer who's attacked by sand people, saved by the guy from Bridge on the River Kwai who is a good space wizard this time, only to come back home and realize his aunt and uncle have been disintegrated. With the help of a cocky smuggler and his pet walking carpets, they fly to the prince's home planet only to find it blown up. They are then sucked into the planet-nuking space station, disguise themselves as space Nazis, rescue the princess, and attempt to fight their way out. In The Empire Strikes Back, we find our heroes in Norway. The moisture farmer is attacked by the abominable snowman, while the smuggler and princess argue but secretly want to have sex with each other. The Empire then attacks the rebels. We have ghosts, robotic dinosaurs, and incest. Eventually our heroes escape. The smuggler flies through an asteroid field, nearly dies, then lands in the mouth of a space worm, while the moisture farmer goes to Florida to learn from Green Buddha. Here we are introduced to the pensioner wizard Space Hitler calls master, Green Buddha lifting spaceships out of swamps and droid cockblocks. The smuggler and the princess arrive at a city in the clouds, meet Billy D. Williams, while the moisture farmer has a vision, leaves Florida and Green Buddha to go help his friends. In Return of the Jedi, our heroes rescue the smuggler from a slug and hang out with teddy bears. That's basically it. Can we please now get to the final act of this movie? Look, okay, I'm not trying to sound mean. Let me remind you that I do actually really like this film, flaws and all, but you have to admit that up until this point, the potential for this movie has been squandered. This video is titled Return of the Jedi, the best and worst of Star Wars. The middle act is the lowest point the original trilogy ever reaches. Now let's talk about one of its highest points. Roughly 82 minutes into Return of the Jedi, the film truly begins. This third act still has flaws, but for the most part, feels like proper real Star Wars again. If the entire movie was as good as its final 40 minutes, if its structure was as efficient as Star Wars and Empire, I think Return of the Jedi would be seen as one of the greatest Part 3s in the history of fiction. And to a greater extent, I think the original Star Wars trilogy would be held in an even higher regard than it is now. Nevertheless, this is what we have. It's still pretty great, so let's talk about this epic final act. So as we all know, this closing battle is split into 3 parts, which run simultaneously in true Star Wars fashion. The first part is the ground section of the Battle of Endor, which I definitely say is the weakest of the 3 skirmishes, if you will. Not only is it led by Han and Leia, who, as I've already mentioned, feel neutered throughout the movie, but it's also just way less grand than it could have been. I understand Lucas didn't want this to overshadow the other 2 conflicts, but it definitely could have been more than just our heroes infiltrating, like, some tiny bunker. I mean, it's called Star Wars. I'm not saying we need the Battle of Pelennor Fields 2.0, but this definitely could have been a little more epic without detracting from everything else. Then there's the issue of the Ewoks, who, as I've already mentioned, I'm inherently fine with. I think there's a version of Return of the Jedi which includes these furry little guys, which doesn't come off as juvenile and merely an attempt to sell a bunch of cuddly toys. I've done some research on the Star Wars canon, and it turns out there actually was a secret council of war which took place, unbeknownst to the rebels, during the second act. In this war council, Chief Chirpa recalls all the villages and tribe members who have been destroyed and slaughtered by the Empire, and convinced not only the village to take up arms against the Empire, but the entire forest whom he persuaded through Ewok messengers. And I love all this. I wish we had actually seen this war council in the film, because look, I know lots of people think the Ewoks are indefensible. Many people think they should have been Wookiees instead, but I do believe this could have all worked so much better if you just showed us why the Ewoks have such hatred for the Empire. Do the whole Vietnam War thing. Present the Empire more like the brutal regime which we see in Andor, and get dark with it, because this all just feels a bit too kiddie and frivolous and low stakes. Instead of showing us the Ewoks taking out the Empire's supposedly best troops by throwing rocks at them, Pippin and Merry style, show them getting massacred at the start, but slowly begin to scatter in badass stuff like this as the tides of the battle turn in the rebels' favour. Have the Ewoks fight side by side with the rebels. Not a... Have the Ewoks fight side by side with the rebels. Fucking hell. Have the Ewoks fight side by side. I can't, I'm sorry. Sorry. I'll probably keep this in. It's just the Pippin and Merry thing just got to me. No, I just have them in my head. Alright. Have the Ewoks fight side by side with the rebels. Fuck off! Alright, Buddhism. Relaxed. I'm fine. Have the Ewoks fight side by side with the rebels. Not as clumsy teddies defeating the galaxy's greatest army through sheer plot armor, but genuinely vicious animals, passionately putting their lives on the line to defend their home. Their home which has been taken from them by an evil regime, their land which they know far better than the Empire, and which they can use to their advantage in hardcore, guerrilla-type fashion. I'm not saying that the Ewoks are my favourite thing in Star Wars, all I'm trying to prove is that I can see what George Lucas was trying to go for here. And I think it could have worked so much better if he had taken a slightly different approach in how the film portrays the Ewok struggle. Instead of, you know, let's float C-3PO in the air. The second part is the space section of the Battle of Endor, which I'd say, along with the Battle of Scarif in Rogue One, is the best space battle we have gotten in Star Wars, at least in the movies. To think this was all done with practical effects is just astounding. There's so many ships on screen at the same time, and it just holds up so well. Here we join such classic Star Wars characters as Lando Calrissian, Nien Nunb, Admiral Akbar, and the GOAT Wedge Antilles, along with the rest of the rebellion in an attempt to blow up the second Death Star, although they need to wait for the ground forces to destroy the shield generator, sure. As I've said, this space section is amazing. Lando in the Millennium Falcon cockpit is just iconic, and I don't really have any notes for this. It's just peak Star Wars. However, the best part of this entire film, and to a greater extent Star Wars as an epic interweaving story, occurs in the Emperor's beautifully designed throne room between himself, Luke Skywalker, and Darth Vader. Upon realizing he is endangering the mission on Endor, Luke surrenders himself to the Empire, still hoping he can turn his father back to the light side, and I absolutely love Luke's resilience here. Despite being told first from Yoda and Obi-Wan, and then here from Vader himself that his father is lost, Luke holds on to his hope. I've heard some people say this scene is quite an anticlimactic reunion between the two characters, considering how their last meeting went, but I disagree. I think the mellow, understated tone of this scene fits the situation perfectly, as the core dynamic between Luke and Vader has transitioned away from merely hitting each other with laser swords to something far more personal and emotional. Many of this scene's most powerful moments are found not in the dialogue, but in the subtle glances and facial expressions exchanged between father and son. Not only is this clearly Mark Hamill's best performance of the original trilogy, but I also think James Earl Jones steps up a level as Vader here. There's this slight vulnerability in his voice which just wasn't there before. You can genuinely tell that there is an incredibly conflicted human being underneath that mask. Even just the way he says, "It is too late for me, son," sends shivers down my spine. We then get to the actual throne room, which, as I've already said, looks sick. And we of course meet the Emperor, who is both the most evil and most camp man in the galaxy. This combination probably shouldn't work, but it absolutely does. The Emperor begins taunting Luke, revealing he's completely aware of the entire Rebel plan, trying to get Luke to snap. These three scenes occurring simultaneously are cut together decently, I'd say, although I do wish we maybe got a bit more of the throne room and a bit less of the Ewoks. It's not too annoying, but it does sometimes feel like the second I get invested in one of the battles, the film cuts away to something else. But anyway, it's nowhere near as messy as the Phantom Menace's ending, for example. Let's try spinning, yeah. Then there is the reveal that the Death Star 2 is actually fully operational, as it blows up one of the Rebel ships. That blast came from the Death Star! It's actually a really great moment in this final act, completely comes out of nowhere, and I adore Lando's trust in Han that he will get the shield down in time. Maybe it would have been nicer if Han and Lando's relationship was more defined in this movie, but it's still a wholesome moment. We then cut back to the ground forces, where there's this really small bit where one of the Ewoks is killed, and honestly, whatever you think about the Ewoks, we can all admit this is pretty sad, and it is a bit of tonal whiplash considering all the other Ewok scenes, but whatever. So eventually the Emperor's taunting makes Luke snap, and we get this brilliant shot of his and Vader's lightsabers clashing.
You know what would be rad? Would be like green and red lasers, get some different colors.
Of course, that's the most raddest combination that lasers can ever be.
This is probably the best lightsaber fight we have gotten so far in Star Wars, at least in live action. The choreography is great, but what truly makes it is the emotion and stakes. We don't want Luke to give in to his anger like the Emperor is encouraging him to, but every time he does, the fight seems to go in his favor. The entire time Luke is trying to reason with Vader, but the Sith Lord is having none of it. He even just hurls his lightsaber at one point, which I've always found pretty hilarious. Eventually we get this beautiful moment where Luke is hiding. We see the lighting on his face resembling the light and dark side. Excellent filmmaking. And then of course Vader begins taunting Luke about how he's gonna turn Leia to the dark side instead, and Luke just fully starts raging. While this scene isn't shot anywhere near as Empire's lightsaber fight, this tracking shot across the staircase has got to be one of the best moments in any Star Wars film. John Williams' score is incredible, of course. We hear this grand epic crescendo and we know the fate of the galaxy is occurring right in front of our eyes. Luke eventually corners Vader. He's fully schooling the guy, giving into his dark side, and at this point Return of the Jedi fully has me on the edge of my seat. This is peak fiction right here. Luke bests Vader, slices off his father's hand, and in a standard story, what would probably happen here is Luke would then kill Vader, kill the Emperor, leave just in time, and rebuild the Jedi Order without ever looking back. However, Star Wars is not traditional in any way, really. George Lucas was never interested in making standard Hollywood films. The guy was an independent movie maker from the beginning, and actually despised Hollywood and its control on the film industry. I think this is why we get stuff like the Ewoks. This is why maybe the prequels are the way they are. But this is also why in Return of the Jedi, Lucas was able to give us the far superior conclusion. Rather than embracing vengeance, Luke stops fighting, choosing a path of redemption and compassion, the Jedi way. In this moment, he realizes that by killing Vader, he becomes the very thing he swore to destroy. He looks at Vader's robotic arm, then looks at his own mechanical hand, before throwing down his lightsaber and uttering those famous words. "I'll never turn to the dark side. You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi like my father before me." Chills. Despite all the other stuff in Return of the Jedi, I really do think this is one of the most powerful scenes in popular cinema. When we first meet Luke Skywalker, he's like this whiny kid who can only really bullseye womp rats in his T-16 back home and go to Tosche Station for some power converters. And now he's throwing his weapon down against the most powerful evil wizard in the galaxy, having just beaten his father in one-on-one combat. and saying no. The cycle of bloodshed ends here. And remember, this is even after his two incredibly wise, peace activist teachers have told him killing Vader and the Emperor is the only way this war's gonna end. I think it's beautiful. I think it's a really powerful, spiritual moment, which kind of makes you forget about all of the movie's inconsistencies. And I'll just briefly touch on this here. While I'm not among those people who incessantly complain about The Last Jedi online, at the end of the day I just don't consider those movies canon. I do absolutely get the widespread criticism regarding the fraudulent portrayal of Luke Skywalker in that movie. Just completely goes against what is the central emotional crux of the original trilogy, and especially its final entry. But anyway, speaking of emotion, we then get the redemption of Anakin Skywalker, which is just amazing. Like, it can't be understated how good this is. So Luke has thrown down his lightsaber, and in this moment he has become a Jedi. The Emperor even acknowledges this, calling Luke a Jedi before revealing he is in fact not some powerless old politician, but a man powerful with the dark side of the Force, electrocuting Luke to the floor and watching as he writhes around in agony. And I'll never be able to explain it, but in this moment you can see the conflict on Vader's face, even though the guy is wearing a mask. I don't understand how, but you can just see the turmoil within him. He looks at both his master and his son, the latter of whom is pleading for his help, and the moment he picks up the Emperor and throws him down the second Death Star's shaft, I get a very rare type of chill all over my body, which only really a few films can give me. Anakin Skywalker is able to bring balance to the Force through the love of his son. Luke Skywalker doesn't kill the bad guy, he redeems him. Looking back on the trilogy, he goes from saving the princess, to saving his friends, to saving the villain. He defeats evil not through violence, but through compassion, love, peace, integrity. All things George Lucas believed deeply in. There's debate online over what the title of Return of the Jedi refers to. In my opinion, the answer is threefold. The first is of course Luke Skywalker, who becomes a true Jedi when he throws his lightsaber to the floor and states he will not choose violence. The second answer refers to the Jedi in the plural sense, who were removed from the galaxy for so long, but who have now made a grand return, in the form of both Luke. And the third meaning of Jedi, which of course refers to Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, who was once a Jedi, who lost his way, but who in his final moments became a Jedi once more. We then cut back to the Battle of Endor space battle. By this point Han and Leia were able to destroy the shield generator. I won't touch on that too much as it is kind of forgettable in my opinion and sort of gets lost in the sheer epicness of the other two conflicts. But anyway, my boy Wedge and Lando fly into the second Death Star. It's far more complicated and claustrophobic than the trench run in the first film. I love Lando saying, "Here goes nothing." So cool. We also get this amazing moment where this rebel pilot, realizing he's going to die anyway, kamikazes into the Executor, which is like the Empire's main Star Destroyer. There's huge explosions, it literally collapses into the second Death Star, and all the rebels are cheering and celebrating except for Admiral Akbar, who just like slumps down, half in relief, half in mourning for the dead. It's such an awesome but poignant moment, like even amid all the chaos and destruction of this final act. We're still able to get small moments like this, which is just great. Another example of this occurs immediately after, as we see all the Empire's troops running away to evacuate. Let's face it, they probably have the Battle of Yavin in their mind and don't want to suffer the same fate as everyone on the first Death Star. But amid all this, we have Luke carrying Anakin to his ship. No one else, despite the fact they literally worked for Vader, are even looking over, let alone stopping to help. They've completely abandoned the Empire in this moment, and are just worrying about their own safety. Except, of course, for Luke, the Jedi. And here we have this beautiful moment where Anakin requests to see his son with his own eyes. Luke says he has to save him, and Anakin replies with, "You already have." Honestly, it's just so good. We all know what happens next. Lando and Wedge are able to blow up the second Death Star. Yeah, it's kind of a retread of the first film, but honestly, I don't really mind. The moment the Millennium Falcon flies out of the explosion just in time is too iconic for me to really care at this point. Vader's funeral, I think, is another one of the best scenes in Star Wars history. We get a beautiful rendition of John Williams' Force theme, and I love the fact that only Luke is there. I don't really blame the rebels for not attending, considering Vader was kind of a space Hitler, but it means we can have this very personal moment between father and son, and really introspect on the long path Luke has walked in these three films. It really is such a perfect portrayal of the hero's journey. and just goes to show that sometimes the classic, simple stories are the best ones that can be told. And then, last but not least, we have the celebration on Endor. For me, the despecialized editions are worth it just to hear Yub Nub, an all-time classic in John Williams' discography. We of course get that saga-defining moment where Luke looks upon the ghosts of Anakin, Obi-Wan and Yoda. Incredibly iconic, yada yada yada. I do think this is all a tiny bit rushed, just a tiny bit. Like, I would have been fine with a few more minutes of celebration, maybe a conversation between Luke and Leia talking about Vader or something like that. It is all a tiny bit frivolous for the final few minutes of an epic space opera. I mean, look at Lando's clapping and dancing in the final shot. But I don't know, man. The thing is, and we're sort of concluding now, Return of the Jedi makes me feel like a prequel fan. I know the finished product is nowhere near as good as it could have been, but I can't help but find it all kind of endearing. According to Gary Kurtz, who produced the first two films but left Jedi at some point in pre-production, the film had originally been far darker and more poignant, including the death of Han Solo and ending with Luke Skywalker walking into the sunset, alone and exhausted, much like the hero in a spaghetti western. And I'm not gonna lie, that does sound awesome. I would have much rather had that than the ending we got. But at the end of the day, Return of the Jedi is Return of the Jedi. It's what we have, and for what it is, I do like it in a weird way, and therefore, I can't bring myself to give this movie a rating. My dark side wants to be emotional and give this an 8 out of 10, yet my light side is telling me to stay grounded and admit this is like a 4. It's definitely nowhere near as good as Star Wars and Empire, and 100% does not live up to its epic potential. However, much like how Anakin redeems himself at the end of his life, I feel like Return of the Jedi seriously redeems itself in its final act. If the last 30 minutes had been as disappointing as the rest of the film, I really don't think I would have ever forgiven George Lucas, but luckily he was able to pull it out of the bag one last time. Thank the maker. No more Star Wars films were ever made. Oh dear.